In the town of Bitter Hollow, they didn't tell ghost stories around the campfire. They just pointed at the man walking down the street. His name was Elias Crow, and every step he took sounded like a nail being hammered into a coffin. The earth itself seemed to groan under his boots. Mothers would see him coming and yank their children indoors. Shopkeepers would suddenly find their shutters fascinating, and the saloon would go quiet just for a second as his long shadow fell across the doorway. They called him a monster. He never argued. He just wore the name, like he wore the scars that twisted the right side of his face into a roadmap of some forgotten hell. A fire, they whispered. A fire sent by God to mark a sinner. His hat was always pulled low, but you couldn't miss the way the skin was melted and pulled tight, the way one eye was a clouded milky white, and the other a chip of cold gray granite. He was tolerated, not welcomed. He was the man they called when a well collapsed, or a horse died in the river, or heavy beams needed lifting. They'd pay him in scraps, a few coins maybe, but mostly in silence. A silence that screamed, "You don't belong here." Tonight was no different. He was walking toward the livery where the owner let him sleep in an empty stall for the price of mucking it out. That's when he heard it, the laughter of children. But it wasn't the happy kind. It was sharp, cruel, honed to a razor's edge. "Your mama's dead 'cause she sinned. You ain't got no family." A small stone cracked against a wooden wall. Another skittered across the dirt. Elias slowed. His good eye flickered toward the alley beside the mercantile. A small girl no older than 8 was backed against the wall. Her dress was faded, her hair a tangled mess of wheat. 3 older boys had her cornered, their faces twisted with playground malice. One of them was weighing a rock in his palm, a nasty grin on his face. The girl didn't cry. Her little chin was up, her fists were clenched, but you could see the loneliness in her eyes, a canyon deep and wide. Elias didn't say a word. He never did if he could help it. He just stepped into the mouth of the alley. His shadow fell over them like a death sentence. The boy with the rock dropped it like it was a hot coal. Their bravado evaporated in a heartbeat. They knew the stories. They'd heard the whispers. They'd seen the monster in the flesh. They scrambled, tripping over their own feet to get away, their panicked yelps fading into the dusk. The little girl didn't move. She just stood there, pressed against the wall, watching him. Elias expected her to run too. Everyone always ran, but she didn't. She tilted her head, her gaze steady, as if she were looking at a puzzle everyone else had gotten wrong. Her eyes traced the burn scars on his cheek, the clouded ruin of his other eye. And then she spoke. 4 words that hit him harder than any fist. "You're not a monster." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. It was like a physical blow, knocking loose something he'd kept locked down for years. He'd been called sinner, devil, curse, but never that, never a denial. His scarred hands twitched at his sides. He wanted to turn, to disappear back into the shadows where he belonged. But her eyes held him fast. She stepped past him, a quiet dignity in her small frame. The brush of her patched sleeve against his coat was so faint he might have imagined it. He stood there, rooted to the spot, long after she was gone. He walked back to his shack that night, the girl's words echoing in his head. "You're not a monster." With each echo came the memory of flames, the sound of screaming, the smell of burning pine. He remembered his own name, cursed by a dying voice. His own. He pushed the memories down, but he couldn't push away the image of her eyes. Eyes that hadn't seen a monster. They'd seen a man. The next morning the town was buzzing. The pastor, Jedediah Marsh, stood outside the mercantile, his voice rolling over the small crowd like thunder from a clear sky. "There is evil in our midst," he boomed, his silver beard wagging. "A man scarred by God's own judgment, and we let him set his shadow over our children." People nodded. They muttered their agreement. The fear he stoked was a comfortable, familiar thing. Across the street, Elias saw her again. The girl, Ruth Whitaker. She was wrestling with a water bucket almost as big as she was. Her father, Jonah, was a ghost in his own life, haunted by the bottle ever since his wife was buried. He left the girl to fend for herself. Elias hesitated. He knew what would happen. He knew the whispers would follow. He crossed the street anyway. He took the bucket from her small red hands. It felt weightless. He carried it to her door, set it down, and turned to leave before she could say a word. but he felt her eyes on his back. And for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like judgment. That evening, when he got back to his lean-to shack at the edge of town, something was waiting for him on the step. A single yellow wildflower. He picked it up. His hands, calloused and scarred from work and fire, trembled just a little. He took it inside and set it on his rickety table. He just sat there staring at it as the sun went down. For years, Bitter Hollow had given him nothing but stones. And just like that, someone had given him a flower. But that wasn't all. Tucked beneath the stem, almost hidden, was something else. A tiny bird carved from a scrap of wood. It was crude, unfinished, but the shape was unmistakable. A sparrow. Elias's blood ran cold. He reached into the worn leather pouch he kept tied to his belt, the only thing he'd saved from the fire. His fingers, clumsy with shock, pulled out a matching bird. Perfectly carved, smooth with age. One he'd made for his own daughter, the day before the fire took her. They were identical. It wasn't possible. The days that followed were a blur of tension. The town watched him. Pastor Marsh's sermons grew more pointed, his words painting Elias as a demon creeping into their lives, using a child as his shield. "The devil marks his own," Marsh bellowed from the pulpit, "and those who walk with him share his damnation." All eyes went to Ruth, sitting alone in the back pew. Her father was likely passed out in the saloon. Elias saw her after the service. She looked small, lost. But then she saw him standing in the shade of the blacksmith's forge, and she smiled, a small, secret smile that felt like a shield against the whole town. Later, he found her struggling with a sack of feed. He lifted it to his shoulder without a word. When he set it down at her door, she stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. She pushed a small piece of stale bread into his hand. "I saved it for you." He didn't eat it. He couldn't. He put it on the table in his shack, right next to the wildflower and the two impossible birds. A collection of miracles he didn't understand. The warnings started getting louder. Sheriff Abel Ross, a weary man who looked like he carried the town's sins on his shoulders, stopped him by the livery. "Crow," he said, his voice low, "I don't know what's between you and that girl, but this town is a dry field in a lightning storm. You're giving them a reason to strike the match." Elias just nodded, his hands never stopping their work mending a broken harness. "You got enough ghosts," Ross sighed. "Don't add hers to the list." That night, Elias dreamed of the fire, of the screams, of his little girl's face, lost in the smoke. But this time, something was different. As the flames closed in, a small hand reached through the blaze, unafraid. He woke up in a cold sweat. The next evening, the sun bled out across the sky, painting the clouds crimson. Elias walked his usual path, a ghost on the edge of town. And Ruth was waiting for him. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look at the twitching curtains in the windows all around them. She walked right up to him, her face set with a strange determination. She reached out her small, chapped hand, and she placed it in his scarred, burned hand, the hand the whole town saw as cursed. Her small fingers curled around his, warm and steady. Gasps came from the houses. Whispers grew into a venomous hiss. But Ruth didn't look at them. She looked right up at Elias, her eyes clear as a summer sky. "I'm not afraid," she said, her voice soft but caring in the sudden hush. Elias froze. He couldn't breathe. It wasn't just the touch. It was something else. As her fingers settled against his palm, she started to hum, a quiet, simple tune, a lullaby, the same lullaby his wife used to sing to their daughter, a song no one else in this world should know. The hand in his no longer felt like a child's. It felt like a ghost's. The town saw a monster holding a little girl's hand. But Elias felt something far more terrifying. He felt the past reaching out from its grave, and he had no idea if it had come to save him or to drag him back into the fire. The touch of her hand was a brand. The lullaby was a key, unlocking doors in his mind he had nailed shut and tried to burn down. For 7 nights he didn't sleep. He'd sit at his table, the two wooden birds side by side, and he would replay that moment. Her hand, her song. It made no sense. Ruth Whitaker had been born 2 years after the fire. She couldn't know that song. It was a secret melody, a ghost on the air. Unless she wasn't just a little girl. He started watching her, not just to protect her, but to understand her. He saw the way she talked to herself sometimes, humming that same tune. He saw the way she would stare at the burned-out patch of land on the far side of the creek, the place where his home used to be, the place no one in town ever went near. She would stand there for hours as if listening to something only she could hear. The town's fear curdled into something uglier. They didn't just shun Ruth anymore. They treated her like she was tainted, a leper. Mothers would physically drag their kids to the other side of the street when she walked by. The storekeeper started charging her father double for flour. It was a slow, cruel strangulation. And through it all, she kept seeking Elias out. One afternoon, she found him by the river. He was skipping stones, a habit from a life he barely remembered. She sat beside him, not saying a word, and watched the rocks bounce across the water. "My mama used to sing me a song," she said out of the blue, "about a little bird who couldn't fly. She said an angel taught it to her." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs. "An angel?" he rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "She said the angel had a face like the sun," Ruth continued, her eyes distant, "and she lived in a house by the creek before it burned." He felt the world tilt. Ruth's mother, Sarah Whitaker. He remembered her. She'd been his wife's closest friend, a kind, quiet woman. She had died a year ago. The town said it was fever. But Jonah, her husband, had started his dive to the bottom of a bottle right after. Suddenly, things started to click into place. Awful, jagged pieces of a puzzle he never wanted to solve. The next day, he did something he hadn't done in years. He went into town during the day. He walked straight to the sheriff's office. Abel Ross looked up from his paperwork, his expression shifting from surprise to caution. "Crow," he said, his hand staying near his gun. "What do you want?" Elias didn't speak. He just walked to the desk, pulled the two wooden birds from his pouch, and set them side by side on the sheriff's desk. The old one he'd made, and the new, crude one Ruth had left him. Sheriff Ross stared at the birds. The color drained from his face. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, pointing at the new one. "The girl," Elias said. Ross leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. He looked old, defeated. "I told you to stay away from her," he said, but there was no threat in it, only a deep, aching weariness. "Her mother," Elias pushed, the words tasting like rust in his mouth. "Sarah, what happened to her?" The sheriff closed his eyes. "The official report says it was fever, Crow. You know that." "I know what the town says," Elias growled, a fire he thought long dead starting to smolder in his gut. "I'm asking you." Sheriff Ross was silent for a long time. Then he opened a drawer, pulled out a bottle of whiskey and two dusty glasses. He poured. He pushed one glass toward Elias. "Some things," the sheriff said, his voice barely a whisper, "are better off staying buried. Some fires are meant to burn out." "This one didn't," Elias said, ignoring the drink. "It's still burning." Ross took a long drink, his knuckles white around the glass. "Sarah didn't die of a fever," he finally admitted, his eyes fixed on the birds. "She saw something she shouldn't have. The night of your fire, she was there. She tried to help your wife, your girl." The room felt like it was shrinking. Elias could barely draw breath. "She saw what happened?" "She saw who happened," Ross corrected, his voice dropping even lower. "And it broke her mind. She spent the last few years of her life lost in memories that weren't hers, talking about angels with faces like the sun, singing lullabies. Jonah couldn't take it. He started drinking to forget what his wife couldn't." Then the sheriff looked Elias dead in the eye, and this was the twist that changed everything. The fire wasn't an accident, Crow, and it wasn't God's judgment. He leaned forward, his voice a conspiratorial hiss. It was a cleansing, and our good Pastor Marsh, he wasn't just holding the Bible that night, he was holding the torch. The world stopped. The saloon noise outside, the creak of wagons, the distant hammer of the blacksmith. It all faded into a deafening roar in Elias's ears. Pastor Marsh, the man who stood in his pulpit every Sunday and condemned Elias as a monster marked by God, was the very man who'd sent his family to their graves. It wasn't judgment, it was murder. Why? Elias finally managed to force the word out. His throat was tight, as if a rope was already cinching around it. Sheriff Ross slumped back, the fight gone out of him. You were a wild man back then, Crow. Always drinking, fighting. You beat one of Marsh's deacons half to death in a card game 2 days before the fire. Marsh and his flock. They saw you as a sickness in this town. They decided to cut it out. He gestured vaguely toward the window. Some of the men who wanted to hang you last week, they were probably there that night too, following their pastor's righteous orders. The betrayal was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodging itself in Elias's heart. The men he saw every day, the men who whispered monster when he passed, were his family's killers. And the sheriff. You knew, Elias stated. It wasn't a question. You knew all this time. Ross couldn't meet his eyes. He stared into his whiskey glass as if it held all the answers. I was a young deputy, scared. Marsh is a powerful man. He said it was God's will, that your wife and daughter were tragic sacrifices for the greater good of Bitter Hollow. I looked the other way, and I've been paying for it every day since. Elias stood up. The chair scraped against the floor, a raw, ugly sound. He felt a cold calm settle over him, the kind of calm that comes before a hurricane makes landfall. For years he had carried the guilt. He had believed he was the monster. He had let their whispers build a prison around him, and it was all a lie. He walked out of the sheriff's office, leaving the untouched whiskey on the desk. He didn't know where he was going. He just walked. He walked past the mercantile, past the saloon, past the faces of the people who had judged him, hated him, and hidden the knives behind their backs. He found himself at the edge of the creek, staring at the blackened patch of earth where his life had turned to ash. And Ruth was there. She was sitting on a fallen log, humming her mother's borrowed lullaby. She looked up as he approached, her expression sad and knowing, as if she understood everything. They're bad men, she said, her small voice cutting through his rage. They hurt the angel. That's when the church bell began to toll. Not the slow, steady ring for Sunday service. It was a frantic, panicked clang, the sound of an alarm, the sound of a mob gathering. Elias looked back toward town. He saw figures running, torches being lit even though the sun was still high in the sky. He heard a voice rise above the others, a familiar thunderous voice. It was Pastor Marsh. He knows! Marsh was screaming, his voice raw with panic. The monster knows the truth. He'll come for our children. We have to stop him. We have to finish what we started. Elias looked from the approaching mob to the small girl sitting on the log, the girl who carried his wife's memory, the girl whose mother had been the only witness. He finally understood. Marsh wasn't just afraid Elias would seek revenge. He was afraid Elias would talk to the one person who could confirm the story, the one person who held the key to the past. Ruth. The mob wasn't coming for him because he was a monster. They were coming for him to silence the last witness. Suddenly the sky opened up. A freak storm. Black clouds boiling over the mountains. Rain began to fall in thick, cold sheets. The world dissolved into a gray blur of water and noise. The mob was a collection of blurred torches, a wave of hatred coming for them. Run, Elias growled, grabbing Ruth's hand. They plunged into the woods as the first men reached the creek, their shouts lost in the rising wind. The ground turned to slick mud beneath their feet. Branches whipped at their faces. The river beside them was beginning to swell, its calm surface churning into a brown, angry froth. Elias knew these woods better than anyone. It was the only place he'd felt safe for years. He half dragged, half carried Ruth through the downpour, his only thought to get her away, to get the truth away. But the mob was relentless. They were fueled by years of self-righteous fear, and now, the terror of being exposed. Their lights fanned out behind them, cutting through the rain-soaked darkness. They came to a ravine. The old rope bridge that crossed it was swaying violently in the wind. It was their only way across. The river below was now a raging torrent. Hold on to me, Elias yelled over the storm. He wrapped one arm around Ruth, holding her tight against his chest, and stepped onto the bridge. The ropes groaned. The wooden slats were slick with rain. With every step, the bridge swayed, threatening to toss them into the churning water below. They were halfway across when a shot rang out. Splinters exploded from the rope support right next to his head. He looked back. Pastor Marsh stood on the other side of the ravine, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of insane fury. "The Lord demands a sacrifice," he screamed, his voice a banshee's wail against the storm. Another shot. This one hit one of the main support ropes. With a sound like a giant sigh, the rope snapped. The bridge lurched violently, dropping to one side. Ruth screamed. Elias lost his footing. For one heart-stopping second, they were airborne. Then they hit the side of the ravine, sliding down the muddy embankment, rocks and roots tearing at them. Elias twisted his body, taking the brunt of the fall, shielding the little girl with his own. They tumbled into the freezing, violent water. The current seized them immediately, dragging them under. It was a liquid monster, pulling them into the dark. Elias's lungs burned. He held on to Ruth with a death grip, his other arm flailing, trying to find the surface. Debris slammed into him. Branches, rocks. The roar of the water was absolute. He thought of the fire, the smoke, the feeling of being powerless. Not again. With a final desperate surge of strength, he kicked toward a faint glimmer of light. They broke the surface, gasping, choking. The river was a chaotic nightmare, trying to tear Ruth from his arms. He saw a large fallen tree lodged against the riverbank just ahead. It was their only chance. He fought the current, every muscle screaming, his body a mass of cuts and bruises. The river tried to pull them past, back into the rapids. He lunged, his fingers catching on a splintered branch. He held on, the force of the water threatening to rip his arm from its socket. Slowly, painfully, he pulled them out of the main current, dragging them into the relative calm behind the logjam. He hauled Ruth onto the bank. She was coughing up water, pale and shivering, but she was alive. He collapsed beside her in the mud, his body trembling with exhaustion and cold. The storm was starting to pass. The rain lessened to a drizzle. Across the river, the mob's torches were gone. They probably thought the river had finished the job for them. Elias looked at the small girl curled up beside him. She had looked at his scars and seen a man. Her mother had looked at a fire and seen the truth. He had spent years hiding in silence, accepting the name of monster. But now he knew the real monster's name, Jedediah Marsh, and the hunt was no longer over. It had just been reversed. Lying there in the mud, with the last witness to his family's murder safe beside him, Elias Crow made a new promise. He wasn't just going to survive. He was going to bring the truth back to Bitter Hollow, and justice was coming with him. As dawn painted the bruised sky in shades of gray and pink, Elias staggered back into Bitter Hollow. He wasn't sneaking. He wasn't hiding. He walked right down the middle of the main street, the half-drowned, shivering form of Ruth Whitaker held securely in his arms. His clothes were ripped to shreds. Blood matted his hair and traced new paths through the grime on his face. He looked less like a man and more like something clawed back from the grave. The town was just waking up. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. And then a collective gasp. They saw him. They saw the girl in his arms. The whispers started immediately. "He has her." The monster finally took her. But this time the whispers were laced with something else. Confusion. He wasn't dragging her. He wasn't hurting her. He was carrying her like something precious, shielding her from the morning chill. Pastor Marsh was the first to react. He burst out of the church, his face pale with shock, quickly replaced by a mask of righteous fury. He'd clearly assumed they were dead. "There he is," Marsh roared, pointing a trembling finger. "The beast! He tried to steal her away, but the Lord's storm turned him back. He has brought his corruption back to us." Men began to pour out of the saloon in their homes. They weren't holding torches and ropes anymore, but their faces were hard, their hands empty but ready. Sheriff Ross emerged from his office, his hand on his gun, his face a grim, unreadable slate. The town formed a semicircle around Elias, trapping him. "Give us the child, Crow," someone shouted. "He's bewitched her." Another yelled. Elias ignored them all. He walked forward until he was standing right in front of Pastor Marsh. He gently lowered Ruth to her feet. She swayed, and he kept a steadying hand on her shoulder. Then he looked Marsh dead in the eye. For the first time, there was no hiding, no shame, only a cold, burning light in his one good eye. And he spoke. His voice was a raw rasp, but it carried across the silent street. "You missed," he said. Pastor Marsh flinched, a flicker of panic in his eyes before he covered it with piety. "The devil's words are poison," he thundered at the crowd. "He speaks only lies. Look at him. The evidence of his sin is carved on his very flesh. He is a monster." "Yes," Elias said, his voice dropping, becoming more dangerous. "There is a monster in this town, but it's not me." He turned his gaze from Marsh to the crowd, to the men who had whispered and judged, to the men who had followed their pastor into the night with fire in their hearts. "For years I let you call me that," he said, his voice growing stronger. "I believed it myself. I believed the fire that took my family was a punishment for my sins, my drinking, my fighting. I carried that guilt like a shroud." He took a step forward, and the crowd instinctively took a step back. "But the fire wasn't a judgment from God," Elias continued, his voice ringing with a terrible clarity. "It was an act of man. It was murder." A nervous murmur rippled through the townspeople. They looked at each other, then at the pastor, whose face had gone rigid. "Lies! Blasphemy!" Marsh shrieked. "He's trying to turn you against God's own chosen servant." "Your mother," Elias said, looking down at Ruth, his voice softening for just a moment. "She saw, didn't she? She saw who lit the fire. That's why she was so sad. It wasn't a fever that took her. It was a secret that was too heavy for her to carry." He then looked back at Marsh. "She saw you, Jedediah. She saw you and your righteous followers douse my home in oil. She heard you say you were cleansing, bitter hollow of a sinner." The silence that followed was absolute. You could hear the creek flowing 100 yards away. Every eye was now on the pastor. His righteous anger was gone, replaced by the cornered look of a rat. "He's mad," Marsh sputtered, looking desperately at the crowd for support. "The river scrambled his mind. This is the devil's work." "Is it?" A new voice cut in. Sheriff Abel Ross stepped forward, his shotgun now held loosely in his hands, its barrels pointing at the ground. But his message was clear. "I was a deputy back then," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with a guilt that was years old. "I was told to be at the other end of town that night. I was told a problem was being taken care of. I was young and I was a coward, and I've had to look at my own face in the mirror every morning since." He stopped, his eyes locking onto the pastor's. "But I kept something," the sheriff said slowly. "Evidence, just in case my conscience ever got the better of my cowardice." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a piece of dark, warped metal. "This is the burner from a lantern. I found it in the ashes of Crow's house the next morning. It's military issue, the kind preachers used when they were circuit riders." He held it up for all to see. "Elias never owned a lantern like this in his life. But you did, Marsh. I saw it on your wagon 100 times. The crowd gasped. It was one thing to hear the word of a monster. It was another to hear it from the law, with proof held high. Pastor Marsh's face collapsed. The mask of piety shattered, revealing the ugly, terrified man beneath. He saw the faces of his flock turning on him, their belief curdling into suspicion, then dawning horror. He did the only thing a coward could do. He ran. He shoved a man aside and bolted toward the livery stable, likely for his horse. "He's not getting away," Elias growled. He didn't run. He moved with a predator's purpose, his long legs eating up the distance. The chase was short. Elias cornered Marsh in the stables, the smell of hay and fear thick in the air. Marsh scrambled for a pitchfork, his eyes wild. "I did it for this town! For God!" he shrieked, lunging. Elias didn't even flinch. He caught the handle of the pitchfork, twisted it from Marsh's grasp with one powerful wrench, and threw it aside. He backed the preacher against a stall, his scarred face inches from Marsh's. He didn't hit him. He didn't choke him. The rage was there, a white-hot furnace inside him, but it was tempered by something else. He looked at this pathetic, trembling man and didn't see a demon. He just saw a man poisoned by his own hatred. Killing him would be an ending. It wouldn't be justice. My wife's name was Eleanor, Elias said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. My daughter was named Lily. You will say their names. The sheriff arrived, shotgun raised. The men of the town crowded the doorway, watching, their faces a mixture of shock and shame. Say them, Elias commanded. Eleanor, Marsh choked out, tears of terror streaming down his face. Lily. You didn't cleanse this town, Elias said, his voice breaking with years of unshed grief. You just burned angels. He stepped back and let the sheriff take him. The spell over Bitter Hollow was broken. As Ross locked Marsh in a cell, he started naming the other men who were there that night. One by one, their neighbors pointed them out. The mob of righteous accusers turned on itself, the truth acting like a solvent, dissolving the lies that had held the town together for so long. In the aftermath, the silence that returned to Bitter Hollow was different. It wasn't heavy with judgment anymore. It was filled with shame and maybe the first fragile seeds of atonement. Jonah Whitaker, seeing the truth of what broke his wife, finally put the bottle down and held his daughter's hand. Elias didn't leave. The shack at the edge of town was still his home, but people didn't look away anymore. They'd nod. A few were brave enough to say his name. Morning, Elias. He would just nod back. The scars on his face hadn't vanished. The memories would never fully fade, but they no longer defined him. One evening, a week later, there was a soft knock on his door. It was Ruth and her father Jonah. Jonah was holding a freshly baked loaf of bread. He held it out to Elias, his hand shaking slightly. We... Jonah started, but the words wouldn't come. He didn't need them. His eyes said everything. Elias took the bread. He looked at Ruth, who smiled her bright, fearless smile. She slipped her small hand into his. It felt warm, real, a promise not of forgetting, but of moving forward. I'm not afraid, she whispered, leaning her head against his arm. For the first time, Elias Crow looked at the little girl holding his hand, at the town in the distance, and felt the faintest hint of a smile touch his own lips. The monster was gone, slain not by a gun or a fist, but by the truth. And in his place, a man was slowly, painfully learning to live again. The stories we tell ourselves are powerful. A town can convince itself that a man with scars is a monster, because it's easier than admitting the real monsters might be sitting in the pews beside them. But the truth, no matter how deep you bury it, always finds a way to the surface. It sometimes just needs a small, brave voice to start digging. If you enjoyed this story and believe that the truth is always worth fighting for, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And never be afraid to be the one who speaks up. You never know whose life you might save.